On a gray morning in Moscow in 1982, a KGB surveillance team watched with barely concealed disgust as an American diplomat bent down near a park bench and appeared to examine something on the ground. The object of his attention was a dead rat, its stiff body lying amid fallen leaves near the edge of Gorky Park. The surveillance team made notes in their log, but thought little of it. Another peculiar American behaving oddly in the Soviet capital, perhaps a momentary curiosity about local wildlife. What they could not have known, as they tracked the diplomat's subsequent movements through Moscow streets, was that this unremarkable dead rodent represented one of the most successful innovations in Cold War espionage tradecraft, a solution to a problem that had bedeviled intelligence officers for generations. The story of how a taxidermied rat became a crucial tool in the CIA's arsenal against the KGB did not begin with any grand strategic vision or sophisticated technological breakthrough. Instead, it emerged from the mundane frustrations of intelligence officers who needed to communicate with sources in one of the most heavily surveilled cities on Earth, a place where every movement by American diplomats was tracked, every meeting noted, every suspicious behavior investigated. The dead rat dead drop, as it became known within the CIA, would eventually facilitate some of the most important intelligence exchanges of the Cold War, helping the United States maintain contact with sources who provided crucial insights into Soviet military capabilities, political intentions, and strategic planning. But its origins lay in the simple recognition that successful espionage often depends less on sophisticated technology than on understanding human psychology and exploiting the everyday details that even the most vigilant watchers overlook. Moscow in the early 1980s was perhaps the most challenging environment for Western intelligence operations anywhere in the world. The KGB's 7th Directorate, responsible for surveillance of foreigners, employed thousands of officers and support personnel who maintained comprehensive coverage of Western diplomats, journalists, and business people. Every American stationed at the embassy operated under the assumption that their movements were being monitored, their apartments were bugged, their telephone calls intercepted. The Soviet surveillance apparatus combined human watchers with technical collection systems, creating layers of observation that made clandestine communication with sources extraordinarily difficult and dangerous. The challenge facing CIA officers assigned to Moscow was straightforward in concept but daunting in execution. How to exchange information and materials with Soviet sources without being detected by the surveillance teams that followed American diplomats everywhere they went. Traditional espionage techniques that worked well in other cities, brief personal meetings, car pickups, exchanges in crowds, were far too risky in Moscow, where surveillance was both intensive and sophisticated. A single suspicious meeting could lead to the identification and arrest of a valuable source, followed by interrogation, imprisonment, or execution.
The solution that intelligence services had relied on for decades was the dead drop, a predetermined location where one person could leave material for another to retrieve later without the two parties ever meeting directly. Dead drops had been used successfully throughout the history of espionage, relying on innocuous locations where material could be hidden and later recovered. Hollowed-out rocks, loose bricks, spaces behind radiators, any number of hiding places that appeared natural and would not attract attention. The person making the drop and the person retrieving it would never be in the same place at the same time, making it far more difficult for surveillance teams to establish connections between them. But Moscow presented unique challenges, even for dead drop operations. KGB surveillance teams were trained to notice anything unusual, any deviation from normal patterns of behavior. An American diplomat who suddenly developed an interest in a particular park bench, who walked the same unusual route repeatedly, who paused at odd locations, all of this would trigger suspicion and intensified surveillance. The locations themselves had to be secure from accidental discovery by ordinary citizens while remaining accessible to both the person making the drop and the person retrieving it. Materials had to be protected from weather and from discovery during the potentially long intervals between deposit and retrieval. The Technical Services Division of the CIA, known as OTS, Office of Technical Service, spent enormous effort developing containers and concealment devices that could serve as dead drops. They created fake rocks with hidden compartments, artificial tree limbs with hollow interiors, magnetic containers that could attach to the undersides of vehicles or bridges. But each of these solutions had limitations. Fake rocks, no matter how carefully crafted, might be noticed if surveillance teams became suspicious and started examining locations more carefully. Containers attached to fixed structures could be discovered by maintenance workers or curious citizens. The ideal dead drop container needed to be something so ordinary, so unremarkable, that even if surveillance teams saw it directly, they would pay it no attention whatsoever. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, a technical officer who had been studying Soviet urban environments and the behavior of Moscow residents. He noticed that dead animals, rats, pigeons, occasionally cats, were a common sight in Moscow's parks and alleyways. The city's waste management systems were not particularly efficient, and dead animals would often remain where they fell for days before being cleared away. More importantly, he noticed that Muscovites, like people everywhere, actively avoided dead animals. People would step around them, avert their eyes, sometimes visibly react with disgust. Even street cleaners seemed to delay removing dead animals, perhaps reluctant to handle the corpses.
This observation sparked an idea that seemed absurd at first, but became more compelling as its implications were considered. What if the dead drop container was itself designed to look like a dead rat? An object so repulsive that people would naturally avoid it, so ordinary in the Moscow environment that its presence would generate no curiosity, so unremarkable that surveillance teams would literally overlook it even if they walked right past it. The idea was brilliant precisely because it exploited a fundamental aspect of human psychology, people's instinctive revulsion toward dead animals and their tendency to consciously avoid looking at unpleasant things. The technical challenges of creating a convincing artificial rat were substantial. It couldn't simply be a hollow plastic shell that looked vaguely rodent-like. It had to withstand close visual inspection and appear genuinely deceased. The OTS officers assigned to the project consulted with taxidermists, studied actual rat anatomy, experimented with different materials and construction techniques. They needed to create something that would survive Moscow's harsh weather, from winter temperatures far below freezing to summer heat and rain. The container had to be waterproof to protect any documents or materials placed inside it. It needed to be durable enough to survive being handled during the drops and retrievals, yet not so obviously artificial that anyone who did examine it closely would recognize it as manufactured. The solution involved using actual rat pelts obtained from taxidermy suppliers and stretched over a carefully engineered hollow body made from waterproof polymer materials. The interior cavity was just large enough to hold rolled documents, film canisters, or other small items that needed to be exchanged. The opening was cleverly concealed along the rat's underside, where it would not be visible unless someone actually picked up the rat and turned it over, something that the designers correctly anticipated almost no one would do. The rats were constructed to appear recently deceased rather than decomposed, maintaining the appearance that they had died within the past day or two, recent enough to still have their fur, but not so fresh that they would be immediately removed. Each artificial rat was slightly different, crafted to appear as a unique individual rather than obviously manufactured duplicates. They varied slightly in size, in the condition of their fur, in their positioning when placed. This attention to detail helped ensure that even if someone happened to notice rats in different locations over time, they would not appear to be the same object being moved around, which might trigger suspicion. The weight and balance were carefully calibrated so that if someone did kick the rat or move it with a stick, it would respond with approximately the same physics as an actual rat carcass. The testing phase for the dead rat dead drop was extensive and occurred far from Moscow's streets. CIA officers practiced using the rats in various environments, timing how long it took to deposit or retrieve materials, testing whether the opening mechanism could be operated quickly and discreetly. They studied how real dead rats appeared in various states and positions, learning to place their artificial versions in ways that looked natural. They exposed the rats to weather conditions similar to those they would face in Moscow, ensuring the materials could withstand temperature extremes and moisture. The psychological aspects of using the dead rats also required preparation. Intelligence officers had to overcome their own instinctive revulsion to handle what appeared to be a dead rodent. They practiced approaching the rats, picking them up, opening them, and depositing or retrieving materials until the actions became routine and could be performed smoothly under pressure. They had to learn to appear natural when interacting with what was ostensibly a dead animal, since any visible hesitation or unusual behavior might attract the attention of surveillance teams. The first operational use of a dead rat dead drop in Moscow occurred in 1982 during a period of particularly intense KGB surveillance following several compromised operations. A CIA officer needed to exchange materials with a Soviet source who had provided valuable intelligence on military technology, but whom the CIA could not risk meeting directly. The dead rat was positioned near a park bench in an area that the source was known to frequent during his daily routines. The location was chosen carefully, visible enough that the source could spot it without an obvious search, but in an area where casual passers-by would be likely to avoid it.
The American officer who made the drop approached the location during an early morning walk, one of his regular exercise routes that surveillance teams had observed many times before. He carried the rat in a plastic bag in his jacket pocket, disguised to look like he was disposing of trash. When he reached the predetermined spot, he paused briefly as if to tie his shoe, and in that moment, he removed the rat from the bag and positioned it on the ground near the bench. The entire process took perhaps 10 seconds. Surveillance teams monitoring his walk noted nothing unusual. He had paused briefly but had not stopped at any building, had not met with anyone, had not done anything that suggested an intelligence operation. Several hours later, the Soviet source, walking his normal route home from work, passed the park bench and spotted the rat. To any observers, he simply stepped around it, perhaps with a slight grimace of distaste. But in that moment of stepping around the rat, he quickly bent down as if to adjust his shoe, scooped up the rat and placed it in his own bag, and continued walking. The motion was fluid, practiced, unremarkable. To surveillance teams, if they were even watching this particular Soviet citizen, he had simply walked past a dead rat and briefly adjusted his shoe, nothing worth noting in their daily logs. The success of this first operation validated the dead rat concept and led to its expanded use in Moscow and eventually in other high surveillance environments. Over the following years, the CIA developed an entire menagerie of artificial dead animals for use as dead drop containers in different operational environments. In addition to rats, they created dead pigeons, dead cats, even dead squirrels, each designed for specific locations and scenarios. But the rat remained the most commonly used because rats were ubiquitous in urban environments worldwide, and their presence provoked the strongest avoidance reaction in most people. The operational protocols for using the dead rats became highly refined. Each deployment was planned meticulously, with careful attention to timing, location selection, and the specific source who would be retrieving the material. The CIA maintained detailed intelligence on garbage collection schedules in different parts of Moscow, ensuring that dead drops were positioned and retrieved before street cleaners might remove them. They tracked weather patterns, avoiding deployments during heavy snow when a dead rat on cleared pavement might seem suspicious, or during periods of intense rain that might damage materials despite the waterproofing. Communication about dead drop operations required its own elaborate protocols. The CIA could not simply telephone a source in Moscow to tell them when and where a drop had been made. All communications were monitored by the KGB. Instead, they developed systems of signals, chalk marks on walls, specific advertisements in newspapers, particular positioning of flower pots in windows that could indicate when a dead drop was active without arousing suspicion. Sources were trained to watch for these signals and to know which locations corresponded to which signals,
creating a complex system of indirect communication that kept both parties informed without direct contact. The dead rat dead drops proved particularly valuable for supporting some of the CIA's most important sources in the Soviet Union during the 1980s. While the specific operations remain largely classified, what is known from partially declassified materials and authorized accounts is that the dead rat facilitated exchanges with sources who provided critical intelligence on Soviet military capabilities, including information about new weapon systems, strategic planning, and assessments of Soviet economic problems that were beginning to threaten the sustainability of the arms race. One of the advantages of the dead rat dead drop was its bidirectional capability. Not only could CIA officers leave materials for sources to retrieve, but sources could also use the same containers to pass information to the CIA. A source might position a dead rat at a predetermined location with documents or film hidden inside, signal its presence through the established communication protocol, and then have a CIA officer retrieve it hours or days later. This created a reliable communication channel that did not require any direct contact between source and handler, dramatically reducing the risk to the source. The KGB, despite its sophisticated surveillance capabilities, struggled to detect dead rat operations, even when they suspected such methods were being used. The fundamental problem they faced was the same one that made the dead rats effective in the first place. Investigating every dead animal in Moscow was impractical and would reveal to American intelligence that the KGB was aware of the technique. If KGB officers started examining every dead rat in the city, CIA officers would quickly notice this unusual behavior and would know that the method had been compromised. The KGB found itself in a position where, even if they suspected what was happening, acting on that suspicion would confirm it to their adversaries and burn the intelligence without necessarily catching anyone in the act. There were, inevitably, some close calls and failures. On at least one occasion, a street cleaner, more diligent than usual, collected a dead rat dead drop before the intended recipient could retrieve it. The material inside was lost, though the operation itself was not compromised, since the cleaner simply threw the rat away without examining it closely. In another instance, a dog grabbed a dead rat and began playing with it, to the horror of the CIA officer watching from a distance. The dog's owner, disgusted, eventually convinced the animal to drop it, but the incident highlighted the unpredictable nature of urban environments and the myriad ways that even clever plans could be disrupted by random chance. The psychology of why the dead rats worked so effectively reveals something profound about human perception and attention. Cognitive psychologists have long understood that people have strong tendencies towards selective attention, focusing on things that seem relevant or interesting while actively filtering out things that are unpleasant, routine, or unremarkable. Dead animals fall into a category that triggers both disgust, which causes avoidance, and dismissal as unremarkable urban detritus. Surveillance officers, like everyone else, were subject to these same cognitive biases. They were trained to watch for suspicious behavior, for unusual meetings, for exchanges of materials, not for dead rats. The success of the dead rat also demonstrated a principle that has guided effective espionage tradecraft for centuries. The best concealment often involves hiding something in plain sight by making it appear so ordinary that it generates no curiosity. This principle stands in contrast to the popular image of espionage involving high-tech gadgets and elaborate schemes. The dead rat was certainly a technical achievement in its construction, but its genius lay in the insight that sometimes the most sophisticated solution is the one that appears most mundane. The operational lifespan of individual dead rats was carefully managed. Each rat could only be used a limited number of times before the CIA would retire it, concerned that repeated appearances of similar-looking dead rodents in the same general area might eventually trigger pattern recognition by surveillance teams. The rats were rotated through different locations and were interspersed with other dead drop methods to avoid creating predictable patterns. This operational security discipline helped ensure that the method remained effective over an extended period. The training program for CIA officers who would use dead rats in the field included not just the technical aspects of handling the devices, but also psychological preparation for the unique stresses of this method. Officers had to appear completely natural while approaching, handling, and depositing what looked like a dead animal. Any hesitation, any visible distaste, any behavior that suggested they were handling something other than what it appeared to be could potentially attract attention. Training exercises involved dropping and retrieving the rats under various conditions, including while being actively followed by instructors playing the role of surveillance teams. The dead rat dead drop also required careful logistical support. The artificial rats had to be transported into Moscow, typically through diplomatic pouches that had immunity from Soviet inspection. Once in Moscow, they had to be stored securely at the embassy and prepared for operations. After retrieval, the rats and any materials they contained had to be processed and either reused or destroyed. This entire operational cycle required coordination among multiple people at the embassy, all of whom had to maintain operational security to prevent any leaks that might compromise the method. The counterintelligence implications of the dead rat operations were significant. The KGB invested enormous resources in trying to detect and counter American intelligence operations in Moscow, but the dead rat represented a technique that was peculiarly difficult to defeat. Unlike electronic communications that could be intercepted or meetings that could be observed, the dead rat left almost no detectable signature. The only way to defeat it was to somehow observe the actual moment of deposit or retrieval, which required surveillance teams to be in exactly the right place at exactly the right time and to recognize what they were seeing, despite the fact that it looked like nothing more than someone stepping around a dead rodent. The success of the dead rat operations had broader implications for espionage tradecraft beyond just the specific technique. It reinforced the value of understanding the operational environment in intimate detail, of studying the everyday life of a target city to identify opportunities for concealment. It demonstrated that effective innovation in intelligence often comes from close observation of ordinary life rather than from technology alone. And it showed that psychological insights about human perception and behavior could be as valuable as technical capabilities in designing effective intelligence operations. By the mid-1980s, the dead rat had become a standard tool in the CIA's tradecraft arsenal for high surveillance environments. While Moscow remained its primary application, variations of the technique were deployed in other cities where American intelligence operated under intensive surveillance. East Berlin, certain cities in China, and other locations saw their own versions of the dead animal dead drop, adapted to local conditions and the specific animals that would be unremarkable in those environments.
The eventual compromise of the dead rat technique, to the extent that it was compromised, came not from KGB surveillance detecting the operations, but from defectors in recruitment operations that gave Soviet intelligence insights into CIA methods. When CIA officer Aldrich Ames began providing information to the KGB in 1985, he eventually revealed details about various CIA operational techniques, including dead drop methods. Similarly, when Robert Hansen, an FBI agent who spied for the Soviets, provided information about American intelligence capabilities, he likely included information about dead drop operations. Even with this compromise, however, the dead rat remained effective in many contexts because knowing that a technique exists is different from being able to detect and counter every instance of its use. The KGB could instruct its surveillance teams to be alert for unusual interactions with dead animals, but actually monitoring every such interaction in a city the size of Moscow was impractical. The fundamental advantages of the dead rat, its exploiting of human psychology, and its appearance as genuine urban detritus continued to provide operational value even after Soviet intelligence became aware of the technique. The declassification and public revelation of the dead rat dead drop came gradually, with hints appearing in memoirs and authorized accounts in the 1990s and early 2000s. The International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. eventually put a dead rat dead drop on display, allowing the public to see the device that had played such a significant role in Cold War intelligence operations.
The display reveals the sophisticated engineering behind the apparently simple concept, showing the waterproof interior cavity, the carefully preserved fur, and the concealed opening mechanism. Former CIA officers who worked with the dead rat dead drop have spoken in general terms about its effectiveness, while still protecting specific operational details that remain classified. They describe it as one of the most reliable techniques available for communicating with sources in hostile environments, noting that despite its seemingly crude nature, it represented sophisticated understanding of both human psychology and the operational environment. These officers emphasize that the dead rat was never used lightly. Each deployment was carefully planned and approved at senior levels because of the value of the sources being supported and the risks involved if operations were compromised.
The technical evolution of the dead rat continued throughout its operational use. As materials science advanced, later versions incorporated improved waterproofing, more durable construction, and even more realistic appearance. Some versions included additional features, like the ability to emit a mild scent of decay that further enhanced their authenticity, though this proved to be of limited value and was generally not used because it made the rats more unpleasant for friendly personnel to handle and could attract animals. The ethical and legal dimensions of using dead rats in intelligence operations were never particularly controversial within the intelligence community. Unlike some espionage techniques that raise questions about deception or the rights of individuals, the dead rat was simply a concealment device that facilitated communication with willing sources. It involved no deception of the sources themselves, no violation of diplomatic protocols, and no physical danger to anyone. It was, in essence, just a very clever container for documents and materials, distinguished only by its unusual appearance. The operational security measures surrounding the dead rat extended beyond the immediate users to include everyone in the intelligence community who might have knowledge of the technique. Information about the dead rat was compartmented, meaning that only those personnel with a specific operational need to know about it were briefed on its existence and capabilities. This compartmentation helped protect the method from compromise through the various penetrations of American intelligence services that occurred during the Cold War. Even officers who had high-level security clearances might not know about the dead rat unless they were directly involved in operations that used it. The cultural impact of the dead rat dead drop, once it became known publicly, was surprisingly significant. It captured public imagination in a way that more conventional intelligence techniques did not, perhaps because of its combination of sophistication and apparent absurdity. The image of CIA officers and Soviet sources exchanging secrets through dead rats became a memorable symbol of Cold War espionage, appearing in documentaries, books, and eventually fictional adaptations that borrowed the technique for dramatic purposes. This public fascination revealed something about how people think about espionage, drawn to stories that combine high stakes with unexpected methods. The success of the dead rat also influenced how intelligence services think about innovation and operational techniques. It demonstrated that effective innovation often comes from careful observation and understanding of specific operational environments rather than from trying to develop universal technical solutions. The lesson that emerged from the dead rat was that intelligence officers need to think creatively about the specific challenges they face in particular locations, using intimate knowledge of local conditions to identify opportunities that might not be apparent from a distance. The training examples and case studies built around the dead rat became part of how new intelligence officers were educated about tradecraft principles. Instructors would use the dead rat story to illustrate concepts like exploiting human psychology, understanding operational environments, balancing security with practicality, and thinking creatively about problems. The dead rat became a case study in how effective intelligence work requires more than just following established procedures. It requires the ability to observe carefully, think creatively, and develop solutions tailored to specific challenges. The legacy of the dead rat dead drop extends beyond its specific operational successes to influence how intelligence services approach concealment and communication in the 21st century. While the specific technique of using artificial dead animals may have limited application in the digital age, the principles that made it successful remain relevant. Intelligence officers still need to communicate with sources in hostile environments, still need to move materials without detection, still need to exploit aspects of the operational environment that allow them to operate beneath the notice of hostile security services. The dead rat represents a particular moment in the evolution of intelligence tradecraft, a point where human ingenuity and careful observation produced a solution that was both sophisticated and elegantly simple. It stands as a reminder that in the world of espionage, success often comes not from the most advanced technology, but from the most creative thinking, from the ability to see opportunities in everyday objects and situations that others overlook. The dead rat dead drop was effective precisely because it was unexpected, because it exploited universal human reactions to unpleasant things, and because it demonstrated that sometimes the best place to hide something is right in plain sight, in a form so unremarkable that even those actively looking for hidden messages would pass it by without a second glance.
The officers who conceived, developed, and deployed the dead rat dead drop never received public recognition for their innovation during their careers, working as they did in the shadows of classified operations. But within the intelligence community, the dead rat became legendary as an example of creative problem-solving that achieved sustained operational success in one of the most challenging environments in the world. It demonstrated that effective espionage depends not just on sophisticated technology or elaborate tradecraft, but on understanding the details of everyday life and having the creativity to see how those details can be exploited for intelligence purposes. As the Cold War ended and the intelligence challenges of the 21st century emerged, the dead rat dead drop largely passed into history, a technique whose time had come and gone. But its legacy persists in the lessons it teaches about innovation, creativity, in the practical application of psychology to intelligence operations. The dead rat stands as a testament to the ingenuity of intelligence officers, who, faced with seemingly insurmountable surveillance challenges, found a way to communicate that was hiding in plain sight all along, waiting for someone clever enough to recognize its potential. The story of the dead rat dead drop, once fully revealed through declassification and historical research, became more than just an interesting footnote to Cold War history. It became a parable about the nature of intelligence work itself, illustrating how success in espionage often depends less on exotic gadgets and dramatic operations than on careful observation, creative thinking, and the willingness to try unconventional approaches to difficult problems. In this sense, the humble dead rat, so repulsive to the casual observer, represented some of the finest thinking in intelligence tradecraft during its era, a solution so perfect for its specific problem that it worked again and again, facilitating operations that contributed to American intelligence understanding of the Soviet Union during the crucial final decade of the Cold War. The dead rat dead drop, in the end, was exactly what effective espionage often is. Not glamorous, not particularly high-tech, but brilliantly adapted to its purpose and relentlessly effective at achieving its objective. It was a solution that worked because someone understood that in the world of intelligence operations, success often comes from asking not what is most sophisticated, but what is most likely to be overlooked.